There are moments in love when silence says more than 1,000 words. And sometimes, the people standing outside a relationship believe they understand what is happening better than the two people living it. They see the distance. They notice the unanswered messages. They hear about the misunderstandings. And eventually, they say the words they think will help: you need to move on. That is exactly what happened to the person you love. Their friends looked at the situation and believed it was time to let you go. They told them that waiting was only hurting them. They told them that maybe the connection had already ended. They encouraged them to stop looking at their phone, stop hoping for a message, stop replaying old memories, and start building a life without you. But then something happened that nobody expected. Instead of agreeing with them, the person you love became emotional. Their eyes filled with tears. And when they finally spoke, what came out of their mouth left everyone completely speechless. Because they didn't say, "I'm over them." They didn't say, "You're right. I should move on." They said something that revealed just how deeply you were still living inside their heart. They said, "How am I supposed to move on from someone my heart never stopped choosing?" The room went quiet. Their friends suddenly had nothing to say. Because until that moment, they had assumed the person you love was simply holding on to the past. But they discovered something much deeper. This wasn't about being unable to forget. This wasn't about loneliness. This wasn't about refusing to accept reality. This was about a connection that had affected them in a way they couldn't simply switch off. And perhaps the biggest surprise was that they had been trying to hide it. For days, maybe even weeks, they had been pretending to be okay. They smiled when people asked how they were doing. They acted normal. They went about their routine. They tried to distract themselves. But when your name came up, something changed. Their voice became quieter. Their expression changed. And sometimes, they would simply walk away because they didn't want anyone to see what was happening behind their eyes. Their friends thought they were healing. In reality, they were struggling privately. And then came the conversation that changed everything. One of their closest friends finally looked at them and said, "You have to stop doing this to yourself. You can't keep waiting for someone who isn't here. You deserve to move forward." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like advice coming from someone who cared. But instead of getting angry, the person you love became silent. They stared at the floor. Their eyes became watery. And after several seconds, they whispered, "You don't understand." Their friend asked, "Understand what?" They wiped away a tear and said, "I have tried." That sentence changed the atmosphere immediately. "I've tried to move on. I've tried to convince myself that I don't care anymore. I've tried to keep myself busy. I've tried talking to other people. I've tried telling myself that maybe what happened between us wasn't that important." Then they paused. And with tears in their eyes, they said, "But every time I try to imagine my future without them, something inside me feels wrong." Nobody interrupted. They continued. "I don't know what is going to happen between us. I don't know if they will come back. I don't know if they still feel the same way. I don't even know if I'm allowed to hope anymore." Then came the sentence nobody expected. "But I know what I feel." Their friends were stunned. Because they had been trying to convince this person to forget you. Instead, they were hearing a confession. Not a confession made for attention. Not something dramatic designed to make anyone feel guilty. It was simply the truth that had been hidden beneath all the silence. They still cared. Deeply. And perhaps they had never stopped. One friend asked, "Then why don't you tell them?" The person you love looked away. And after a long pause, they said, "Because I'm scared. Scared of rejection. Scared that you had already moved on. Scared that the person they remembered might not be the person standing in front of them anymore. Scared that one message could change everything. And most importantly, scared that they might finally hear the answer they had been avoiding." But here's where the story becomes even more surprising. Because their friends eventually realized something. They had been looking at the situation from the outside. They saw the distance. They saw the silence. They saw two people who weren't communicating. But they didn't see what was happening internally. They didn't know about the memories. They didn't know about the late-night thoughts. They didn't know how often your name came into the conversation and how quickly the subject was changed. They didn't know about the moments when the person you love secretly wondered whether you were thinking about them too. And they certainly didn't know that moving on wasn't as simple as their friends had imagined. Sometimes people think love disappears when communication stops. But silence doesn't always mean feelings are gone. Sometimes silence means someone doesn't know what to say. Sometimes distance is created by fear. Sometimes pride gets involved. Sometimes two people care about each other but are both waiting for the other person to make the first move. And sometimes, the heart continues holding onto someone long after the mind has decided to let go. That may be what happened here. Your person tried to convince themselves that they were done. But their emotions kept telling a different story. And when their friends pushed them towards someone new, they couldn't pretend anymore. They said something that nobody expected. "I don't want someone new just because everyone thinks I should have someone new. I want the person I actually love." Silence. Absolute silence. Their friends exchanged looks. Because suddenly, they understood. This wasn't a temporary obsession. This wasn't simply missing someone. This person was still emotionally connected to you. And perhaps the most painful part was that they didn't know whether you felt the same. That uncertainty had been eating away at them. They wondered whether you had forgotten them. Whether you had replaced them. Whether you were happier without them. Whether they had waited too long. And these questions became heavier every night. There may have been moments when they opened your old conversations. Maybe they looked at photographs. Maybe they remembered small details that nobody else would understand. The way you used to speak. The things you laughed about. The moments when you made them feel understood. Those little memories can become incredibly powerful when someone is trying to forget. Because you don't miss someone only because of the big moments. Sometimes you miss them because of something tiny. A song. A place. A sentence. A familiar time of day. A notification that isn't there anymore. And that is why their friends couldn't understand why they were struggling. They were trying to solve an emotional connection with logical advice. Move on. Meet someone else. Forget them. Stop waiting. But the heart doesn't operate like a checklist. You can't command yourself to stop caring. You can't force yourself to forget. And you can't replace a meaningful connection simply because somebody tells you that it's time. Then another friend asked the question that had been sitting in the room. If you could say one thing to them right now, what would it be? The person you love took a deep breath. They didn't answer immediately. They cried. And finally, they said, "I never wanted to lose you." That sentence carried everything. Regret. Love. Fear. Longing. And perhaps even an apology. They continued. "If I ever made them feel like they weren't important to me, I wish I could go back and change that. If my silence hurt them, I'm sorry. If my pride made them think I didn't care, I'm sorry. Because the truth is, I cared more than I knew how to explain. Nobody spoke. And then they added, I just wish they knew that I didn't stop loving them. I just didn't know how to come back. That was the moment their friends finally stopped telling them to move on. Because they realized something. Maybe the story wasn't finished. Maybe the distance wasn't the ending. Maybe there were still words that needed to be spoken. Maybe there was still an unfinished conversation between two people who had never truly stopped caring. And if you're listening to this and this story feels strangely familiar, don't ignore that feeling. Because sometimes a person doesn't leave your heart just because they leave your life. Sometimes someone can be physically absent while emotionally present every single day. And sometimes the person who looks like they've moved on is actually fighting the strongest battle inside themselves. They may not be showing it. They may not be contacting you. They may even appear completely fine. But appearances can be misleading. Their friends saw the outside. They didn't see the tears. They didn't hear the confession. They didn't know the truth. And the truth was simple. Your person wasn't ready to let you go. But here's the most important part. Don't turn this message into a reason to chase someone who isn't choosing you. Love should never require you to lose your dignity. If there is a genuine connection, it should eventually move toward honesty, communication, and mutual effort. You don't have to force the future. You don't have to beg for an answer. You don't have to prove your worth. Let the truth reveal itself through actions. Because if your person truly feels what they confess through tears, eventually their actions will have to match their emotions. And perhaps that's what is happening now. Maybe they are finally realizing that avoiding the conversation hasn't protected them. It has only prolonged the pain. Maybe they are beginning to understand that if they want another chance, they have to stop listening to fear and start listening to honesty. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter begins with one simple sentence. Can we talk? Imagine receiving that message after all the silence. Imagine seeing their name appear on your screen. Imagine realizing that the person everyone thought had moved on had actually been carrying the same feelings all along. That would explain why their reaction was so emotional. Because sometimes the strongest love stories aren't the ones without problems. They're the ones where two people finally become brave enough to tell the truth. So if you're wondering what their friends discovered that day, it wasn't simply that your person still misses you. They discovered something much bigger. They discovered that beneath the silence was love. Beneath the distance was fear. Beneath the apparent acceptance was hope. And beneath every attempt to move on was one person their heart kept returning to. You. But remember this. Don't wait endlessly. Don't stop living. Don't put your entire future on hold. Keep growing. Keep becoming stronger. Keep building your own life. Because if your paths are meant to cross again, you want to meet that moment as the strongest version of yourself, not as someone who spent their entire life waiting. And if they come back, let them come back with clarity. Let them come back with honesty. Let them come back with actions. Not empty promises. Not temporary emotions. Not another confusing chapter. Real communication. Real effort. Real accountability. Because the tears they shed may have revealed their feelings, but what happens next will reveal their intentions. And that is the part nobody knows yet. Maybe the conversation with their friends was the beginning of their awakening. Maybe for the first time, they admitted out loud what they had been hiding from everyone, including themselves. Maybe they finally realized that moving on isn't always the answer. Sometimes the answer is simply facing the truth. And their truth was this. They never truly stopped loving you. So don't be surprised if something changes. Don't be surprised if the silence suddenly breaks. Don't be surprised if someone who once seemed distant starts looking for a way back into your life. And don't be surprised if the person who told them to move on eventually becomes the same person encouraging them to finally speak to you. Because after hearing those tearful words, their friends may have realized what they couldn't see before. This wasn't a story about someone refusing to move on. It was a story about someone who had never truly let go. And perhaps the most shocking sentence of all was the one they whispered before leaving the room. I don't know if I can have them back, but I know I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending I never wanted them. Sometimes one honest confession can change everything. And this time, it may have changed the way everyone sees your connection forever. The question now isn't whether they still care. Their tears answered that. The real question is, what will they do about it? And that is where the next chapter begins.